I know it's hard to understand, but sometimes painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
We all want to help one another. Human beings are like that. We want to live by each other's happiness, not by each other's misery.
We have to make an effort to understand, to get beyond or go beyond these rather difficult times.
What we've already achieved gives us hope for what we can and must achieve tomorrow.
Think about it. If you laugh, you think, and you cry, that's a full day. That's a heck of a day.
Men will still say, this was their finest hour.
Hi, I'm Nicholas DeAngelis, and welcome to D-Licious History. Thanks for joining me for episode 4 of Burning for Revolution, The Wicked History. Now, when we last spoke, Roger Williams had just arrived in the New World, and he was primed to cause some controversy. When the Lions arrived in Boston in February of 1631, Winthrop had already exhausted all of his reserve supplies and had given out all of his personal stores. The situation was looking pretty rough, but the Lions arrived just in time. Interestingly, the ship not only carried the much-needed supplies, but it also carried Winthrop's wife and children. Like I said last episode, though, the arrival of Roger Williams was what the colony longed for most. The colony was about to lose a minister, and Williams was the perfect replacement. That is, if Williams wants the job. So the founding of the U.S. has a well-known story, right? Columbus, explorers, pilgrims, war, taxes, shots heard around the world, and then an infamous list of grievances. But every colony's experience was different, and no colony was more radical, and even at times devious, than that of Rhode Island on its road to independence. Is it possible Rhode Island started the American Revolution? No, of course not. But the first shots of that revolutionary era were fired at Fort George on Goats Island, and the first casualty was shot in Narragansett Bay. And the first colony to break ties with the British altogether was Rhode Island. I'm not saying Rhode Island started the war, but our badassery played a role, and being a proud Rhode Islander, I figured I'd share. We're going to discuss the government of Massachusetts Bay Plantation, what it took to be a Puritan, and Williams' immediate and wicked impact in the New World.
Another ain't no rest for the wicked until we close our eyes for good.
You're listening to Burning for Revolution, The Wicked History, Episode 4, The New England Puritans. I probably could have mentioned this last episode because I feel like a lot of people might not know this, or maybe it's just because I grew up with all of it being Massachusetts, but Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay were two separate colonies until 1691. And this is important because it means that they had separate governments, separate churches, and a separate charter with the king. For all intents and purposes, Plymouth was out of the control of Massachusetts Bay, but not necessarily out of its influence. You see, Massachusetts Bay Plantation was far superior to all the other plantations in the region. Aside from Massachusetts, England only occupied Plymouth and parts of what became New Hampshire. Massachusetts Bay was made up of several smaller settlements like Marymount and Newtown. Today that's Quincy and Cambridge. There was also Salem, and Boston was the largest and most influential of those settlements in Massachusetts Bay. Massachusetts Bay was the largest and most influential plantation or colony in all of New England, which included Plymouth. Note that New England is specifically English-held territory in the Northeast, primarily held by Puritans, but was not like an official title. It was just the general term for the region.
But I love that dirty water. Oh, Boston, you're my home.
Now, each of these settlements had their own churches and congregations, and this is kind of important. I'll explain a little bit more in a bit, but if you were a member of the Salem church, you really didn't go to the Boston church, and you definitely didn't go to the Plymouth one. And while each of the churches were independently ordained, all of the Massachusetts towns were governed by the Board of Assistants and the governor. The governor resided in Boston, which certainly made it the most powerful settlement and kind of like the de facto capital. Over the next decade, Massachusetts would welcome 20,000 immigrants, and Boston became the commercial hub of New England. The government of Massachusetts Bay Plantation was, well, unique, we'll say. It's pretty different from anything that had existed before, and that's because Massachusetts made a concerted effort to actually separate church and state. A lot of historians say that this effort prevents them from being classified as a theocracy, or a government ruled by their church. Yeah, but those historians are definitely overlooking a lot of things, and they're trying to make Boston look a little better than it really was. The problem is the simple fact that these people in Massachusetts did not have the foresight nor the inventiveness to truly separate those two things. It was too ingrained in their society. Literally every government in the world, Christian or other, had used the civil government to enforce religious doctrine. The radical who could divide those two entities in his mind had not yet arrived, or at least had not formulated his controversial beliefs. Perhaps he needed Massachusetts as a sort of stepping stone to get him to those conclusions. Now, Massachusetts consisted of a governor, and at this time that was John Winthrop. And he was surrounded by magistrates or assistants, and I'm going to use those terms pretty interchangeably here, so just know that magistrates and assistants means the same thing. These were essentially your mayors or councilmen from each of the individual settlements. It seemed that each settlement elected a few, and one was considered to be the lead magistrate. For Salem, the lead magistrate was John Endicott. The assistants met with the governor regularly to sort of act as an upper legislative and executive body whose job it was to elect the governor, make laws, and enforce them. They also seemed to serve as a Supreme Court who would preside over the most important judicial cases in Massachusetts. There was also a general court that served as the lower governing body, or a general assembly, whose job it was essentially to just elect those magistrates, but occasionally they acted like a lower court system. Now, only members of the general court were allowed to vote or hold office. And here's the issue. To be part of that general court, you had to be a member of a Puritan church. For John Winthrop and the other magistrates of Massachusetts, they couldn't perceive a government that wasn't influenced by the morals of a church, and a church that wasn't bolstered by the efforts of a state. This included gender roles, with men mainly doing manual labor and women mainly raising a family and maintaining the household. Drinking was limited to just festivals, and excessive drinking was frowned upon. Theater was illegal, gambling was illegal, and many games were illegal or heavily tabooed. Even what they wore was dictated by law, and all of these regulations were directly influenced by their religious beliefs. To the truest and most humblest Puritans, this was paradise. However, it was explicit in Massachusetts that a minister could not serve as a governor or his assistant simultaneously. And that's great, because that's a clear separation of church and state. If you were a church minister, you could not hold civil office. However, the governor and his assistants could not hold civil office if they were not members of that church. In addition, the civil government was responsible for encouraging church membership and its attendance. And services were held twice a day and 3 times on Sunday. Your attendance was mandatory by law. And the magistrates would not sentence a criminal without the church first making a statement on what that punishment should be, and they would only carry out the punishments that the general court prescribed, which was made up of only church members. Essentially, that meant if you were not Puritan, you were disenfranchised completely. In other words, regardless of their attempt, this government was still a theocracy, and full adherence to the Puritan church was absolutely required. And I'll admit, the intensity of scrutiny offenders would face would seem to depend on what was going on around the world and how that would affect Massachusetts. You'll see what I mean in coming episodes, but nevertheless, as a general rule, conformity to the Puritan doctrine was a necessity. When Williams left England, the world was seemingly collapsing around him. He was a separatist Puritan who not only hated the Catholic Church, he despised the Anglican one too. No part of the Book of Common Prayer was Christian, no part of Catholicism could be saved, and the High Commission was intent on corrupting all of England.
Making your way in the world today takes everything you've got. Taking a break from all your worries sure would help a lot. Wouldn't you like to get away?
William simply did not want to face any more religious persecution any longer, and he had several options for escape, including New Amsterdam with the tolerant Dutch or Bermuda with other Puritans, but it was no question. Williams knew exactly where he wanted to go.
Sometimes you wanna go where everybody knows your name, and they're always glad you came.
When Williams arrived in Massachusetts, John Wilson was just preparing to leave. And this was perfect for Winthrop. He finally had his wife and children, the much-needed supplies, and a new minister to replace Wilson. Believe it or not, when Williams arrived in Massachusetts, there were no inns, so he was invited to stay with various members of the colony as a guest. Supposedly, he had so many invitations he did not know who to stay with in order to not insult someone. Essentially, upon his arrival, Williams was very sought after.
Be glad there's one place in the world where everybody knows your name, and they're always glad you came.
And this goes to show you the importance of religion at the time. Boston had been fearing the loss of a minister for several months, and they wanted a replacement before he left. Williams seemed to solve that problem. He was enthusiastically offered a position in the Boston church. But here's the problem. Williams says no. Now you have to consider the fact that this was a really good offer. Williams would have held one of the most important religious positions in the entire world, at least to him. It would have allowed him to fulfill his lifelong dream of becoming a minister. Even upon Wilson's return, Williams was promised that they would preach to the congregation together. I guess that was commonplace in Puritan congregations, to have two ministers. A pastor and a teacher. And honestly, I'm not totally convinced I understand the difference between the two, but I think I have a decent analogy. The pastor preaches to the people of the congregation, essentially telling them what they want to hear, but the teacher explains how that relates to scripture. On a sports team, that's kind of like having your X's and O's coach and a coach that's good with the players. And listen, I know, it's really hard to understand why Williams would say no to this, and there are several theories as to why. I've come to accept two main ones, one by John Barry and the other by Edmund Morgan. Both seem plausible, both seem likely. In other words, they're probably both the reasons for Williams' rejection. John Barry claims that Williams' main issue is that the Boston Church still enforces the first table of the Ten Commandments. The first table is the first four commandments. Things like not taking the Lord's name in vain or going to church every day. The stuff that's not rape, murder, or adultery. Williams believed that only the church could enforce the first table, and then the consequences could only be spiritual. Edmund Morgan claims that the biggest issue for Williams revolves around Boston's unwillingness to repent for ever having prayed with unrepentant Anglicans in England before they came to America. As you can see, there's a bit of evidence for both. The Boston magistrates, Winthrop included, had used the civil government to enforce church attendance and membership, and they had prayed with the Anglicans before leaving England, and they, specifically Winthrop, were not willing to repent for that. But these theories seem a little bit more plausible when he really gets into trouble in a few years. I personally don't believe either of these ideas are actually totally correct. Remember, I'm not a professional historian or historiographer, so take this with a grain of salt, but I think these theories are just too complex for this situation. They're definitely valid, but if you remember the fact that Williams had only been in Boston for 2 months, and that he probably was offered a position in Salem before he left England, it becomes kind of hard to believe that he was so bold to destroy his relationships immediately upon his arrival, especially in an unknown world. I mean, Williams didn't want to pick who to stay with because he didn't want to insult anyone. Does that sound like a man who would ask the entire church to change? Again, professionals seem to think so, but I just don't. And here's why. Williams said much later in his life, and I quote, "I durst not officiate to unseparated peoples." What he means is that the Church of Boston was not separatist. They still acted as though they were part of the Anglican Church. I believe it's that simple. According to Edmund Morgan, John Winthrop stated that Williams wanted the Boston Church to make a formal separation from the Anglican Church. While that probably has some truth to it, I don't think that that's it. Winthrop has reasons to exaggerate Williams' claims and has more reasons to fear what they would mean. In other words, I fully believe Williams wanted them to make a formal statement, but I don't think he asked them to do so. More so, Williams had not interacted with the natives yet, and as you will see in later episodes, I believe that has the most profound effect on his political doctrine. And in all probability, Williams was a pretty tolerant person by this point, in the sense that he believed to each their own. See, I don't think Williams was, at least at this time, trying to make waves or trying to change Christian doctrine. He was just a Congregationalist, which meant he believed that every church had their own theology. He just didn't agree with the Boston Church, and he wished to become part of a church where their theology was just a little bit more in line with his own. And he could find that in Salem, where they were a bit more separatist. In April of 1631, Williams was actually offered a position with the Salem Church, which he was inclined to accept. He even moved to Salem and began gaining a following. People seemed to really like Williams in Salem, and they welcomed him happily. The problem in Boston, however, was not the religious theology William carried, but the affront to the church he had made. He was offered a very important position in a very prominent role in the largest settlement in Massachusetts at a rather desperate time for Bostonians. He straight up said,
"Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn."
Yeah, he could have taken the position and from the inside used his role to change their theology. Instead, he rejected that position outright and took a job in what many Bostonians considered to be the backwater town of Salem. Many people in Boston did not like the people in Salem, and they looked down on them. Remember, when they arrived in the fall of 1630, Salem was so underdeveloped, Winthrop decided to just scrap the original plans and build an entirely new settlement. Yeah, Boston saw Salem as an unsophisticated bump in the road. And again, according to John Winthrop, when Williams arrived in Boston, he requested that the Boston Church make a formal statement repenting for having worshipped with Anglicans. If that is true, the issue is how this would appear in London. Simply, Winthrop thought it would look like this.
I am William Wallace, and I see a whole army of my countrymen here in defiance of tyranny, and dying in your beds many years from now. Would you be willing to trade all the days from this day to that for one chance, just one chance, to come back here and tell our enemies that they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom?
Yeah, a rebellion less than a year into the colony's establishment wouldn't go over well in England. While John Winthrop likely didn't totally disagree with Williams, though he certainly did not agree with him either, he was just more concerned with the survival of his colony. Remember the speech from last episode. There is a lot of weight on his shoulders. Winthrop had political reasons to fear Williams. He may have had been too separatist. Winthrop worried that Williams' preaching in Salem would bring attention from England, and it would look too much like a rebellion. Winthrop couldn't have that in his colony, so he implored Salem not to hire Williams. The magistrates of Boston, clearly the most powerful and influential in the entire colony, threatened to imprison John Endicott, Salem's lead magistrate. His crime was beating a man in public. But because he was a magistrate, the governor's assistants could kind of just forget it happened. Endicott could get off with nothing and would not have to go to prison. This actually seems like it was a pretty common thing for all the magistrates. Their crimes would kind of be overlooked, I guess. But they didn't have to overlook it all the time, and they were threatening to take action this time. Everyone understood why. It was because Salem offered Williams a position, and Boston, Winthrop really, did not want Williams in a position of leadership on his plantation. Under the threat of imprisonment, Endicott encouraged the Salem Church to rescind their job offer. And unfortunately for Williams, their magistrate at this time was just a little bit more important than a new minister. However, this overreach of civil authority by John Winthrop and the Boston Church infuriated the Salem congregation. Lucky for Boston, they weren't in a position to do anything about it. They rescinded their offer, and in April of 1631, Williams, for a third time in 6 months, was forced to uproot his family and move to his last hope in New England, Plymouth Plantation.
You know there ain't no rest for the wicked. Money don't grow on trees.
Tune in next episode to learn more of the minutiae of Roger Williams' personal beliefs and an introduction to the most powerful nation in New England. Thanks for listening. Stay hungry.
Oh no, there ain't no rest.